Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Ramin Talesh, Assistant Vice Chancellor for Student Life and Leadership and Dean of Students at UC Irvine. And I have the honor of introducing someone that I have great respect for, Dr. Anita Casavantes Bradford. Dr. Casavantes Bradford is an Associate Professor of Chicano, Latino Studies and History here at UCI, where she's also the co-director of the UC-Cuba Multi-Campus Academic Initiative. She earned her Ph.D. in 2011 in U.S. and Latin American history at the University of California, San Diego. Her first book, The Revolution is for the Children, The Politics of Childhood in Havana and Miami, 1959-1962, was published in 2014. Her second book, Suffer the Little Children, Unaccompanied Migrant Children and the Geopolitics of Compassion in Postwar America, is actually a book that's forthcoming. She has published numerous articles and essays on a variety of scholarly topics and has even produced a musical, Refugee Songs, a musical journey, which debuted at UC San Diego's Mandeville Auditorium on October 19, 2019. And I learned that about her after talking with her and had no idea. Proud to be an immigrant and a first-generation Latina college graduate, as well as the first woman in her family to complete high school, Casavantes Bradford is a campus leader on issues of equity and inclusion, known for her advocacy on behalf of first-generation, Latinx, undocumented, and veteran student communities. She was the founding faculty chair of UCI's Committee on Equity and Inclusion for Undocumented Students, and the founding director of UCI's First-Generation Faculty Initiative, which became a UC system-wide initiative engaging over 1,000 faculty members in 2018. I keep talking about her founding things. She also was the founding faculty director of the School of Social Sciences First Generation First Quarter Challenge, a program which trains third and fourth year first generation students to serve as mentors and coaches to incoming first generation freshmen. In 2019, she launched the School of Social Sciences Veterans Studies Certificate Program, the first of its kind at a Research One university, to provide student veterans and non-veterans alike the opportunity to interrogate the experiences of diverse groups of veterans throughout US history and contemporary society. She's received numerous awards, the Dynamic Women of UCI Award for Social Justice, the Tom Angel Award, the Social Sciences Dean's Award for Outstanding Mentorship, the Latino Excellence Achievement Award for Outstanding Faculty, and UCI Academic Senate Faculty Award for Mentorship. I can keep going on, but I will stop there and have her spend time talking to you about what matters to her and why. And we will have time afterwards for question and answer as well. So give me some type of emoji to welcome in our fabulous speaker today, Dr. Anita Casavantes Bradford.
Thank you, everyone. It's really an honor to participate in this series, and it's a privilege to tell you a little bit about what matters to me and why. But for that to make sense, I need to tell you a story. I need to tell you a little bit about my life and how I ended up at UCI. So let's begin in 1973, shall we? When I was born in Vancouver, Canada. My Irish-Canadian mother, who was the oldest of 8 children, was the red-headed and blue-eyed daughter of a school janitor stepfather and a taxicab driving mother. And my Catalan Cuban American father was a Korean War veteran and POW who spent most of his 20s self-medicating his undiagnosed wartime PTSD with alcohol, thrill-seeking, and violence before he joined the insurrection against dictator Fulgencio Batista in Cuba in 1957. Following the leftward turn of the revolution and the failed exile invasion at the Bay of Pigs in 1961, my now deeply disillusioned father decided that he needed to leave the US behind. And so he took a job as an apprentice pressure welder in the Yukon Territory of the Canadian Arctic. 6 months later, passing through the city of Vancouver for a weekend of R&R, he met my 17-year-old mother, who was then working as a roller skate car hop at a local A&W drive-in. A few weeks later, she dropped out of high school, said a quick goodbye to her mostly indifferent family, and ran off with him. This unlikely union, perhaps predictably, would turn out to be an unhappy one. But before my parents' frequent stops and starts turned into a permanent separation, my two sisters and I spent our early childhood ping-ponging through a series of temporary homes, shabby apartment buildings and ramshackle rural cottages and unheated mobile homes in a series of trailer parks across British Columbia's lower mainland. A new school every year, sometimes twice a year, as our mother searched in vain for the elusive place that would provide the security and happiness that her relationship with my often absent father failed to provide. I remember those years only as a vague series of snapshots. Me, dressed in a hand-knitted poncho and red rubber boots, my hair in pigtails, for the first day of kindergarten. My sisters and I posing in matching pink dresses for an aunt's wedding. A sparsely decorated Christmas tree in a wood-paneled room. Underneath it, the brightly wrapped Christmas presents my mother had managed to pay for in installments during the previous 6 months. But all of these images are colored with memories of my mother's loneliness and vulnerability and her unspoken battle with depression, the ever-present threat of hunger and homelessness, the constant wondering about where my father, a person I idealized and feared and longed for in equal parts, was, and wondering when he was going to appear next. When I finally asked my father if I could go live with him when I was 12, he reluctantly agreed, after making it clear that he wasn't willing to take on the responsibilities of parenting a child. If I came with him, he said, it would be as a junior partner, expected to manage my own needs and contribute to the smooth operation of the household. Flattered and impressed by my new role, I agreed. I would spend the remainder of my middle and high school years moving back and forth across Canada and the US Northwest, following him from industrial jobs in Ontario to the oil fields of Alberta, getting up at 4 a.m. to cook his breakfast and pack his lunches before he went off to work, and I went off to the latest in a constantly changing series of public schools. He finally deposited me and my older sister, who had decided to join us, in a rented home outside Bellingham, Washington, during my junior year of high school, leaving us largely on our own to figure out how to graduate, or in my sister's case, to drop out and go to work as a nightclub waitress, so that he could go back to work on a major industrial project in the Arctic. But there were good moments during those years too. I remember my father teaching me to dance mambo to old 8 tracks of Cuban music. And he was a wonderful storyteller. He had many stories to tell, even if they did usually deteriorate into rants about a beautiful Caribbean island enslaved by an evil tyrant named Fidel Castro, as well as with warnings to never forget that he, and by extension me, were exiles, people without a nation, without a home to truly call our own. After graduating from high school, upon realizing that as a Canadian citizen, I wasn't legally entitled to attend the American universities my counselors had guided me to apply to, unless I could pay the astronomical international tuition, I moved back to Canada with my mother, who I had only seen 2 or 3 times in the past 6 years. And I enrolled in community college, where despite my 3.9 high school GPA, and my stated desire to register in the University Transfer Latin American Studies program, an academic advisor reviewed my application for financial aid, noted out loud with disapproving that my mother was a welfare recipient, and suggested that I enroll in the 9-month daycare assistant program. That would get me out of school and working and paying my own way as soon as possible, she noted. I dutifully agreed, and spent the next semester in daycare training until a woman instructor in the program pulled me aside and asked what the hell I was doing in that course. When I explained to her that an advisor had told me to enroll in the program, she explained that it actually wasn't up to the advisor, that I was free to choose for myself what I wanted to study. That was news, welcome and liberating news for me. The next semester, I enrolled in my first university transfer classes, signing up for sociology, Latin American history, and an introduction to development studies. Over the next 2 years, I earned an associate's degree in Latin American studies while working 30 hours a week as a live-in domestica in order to be closer to campus and get out of my mother's house, where my presence as an adult now and no longer a dependent threatened her continued access to welfare benefits. Although I fell asleep in classes more than I stayed awake, I met an inspirational professor of Latin American studies who helped me secure funding to attend a summer field school in Oaxaca, Mexico, before I transferred to Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. Once there, despite my community college instructor's encouragement to think about grad school, I knew it was time to get real and figure out what kind of a degree would actually get me a job. But what kind of job? Like most poor young women, I'd never known anyone with a professional job, except my teachers. And so I decided to be a teacher, signing up to complete my BA in history and literature before earning my high school teaching credential. Like many first-gen low-income students, I felt out of place at university, utterly isolated from the middle-class children of doctors and accountants whose stable and privileged lives were entirely foreign to me. But the weekends, that was another story. At the barrio nightclubs where I spent Friday and Saturday nights, dancing to Vancouver's small handful of Latin American immigrant orquestas, I made for the first time Spanish-speaking friends. Most of them were from poor or working-class families too. Many of them children of the Central American refugees who began arriving in Canada in the 80s after they were denied asylum in the US. My new Salvadoran, Guatemalan, and Nicaraguan friends told me about their admiration for the Cuban Revolution and their anger at US interventions in Latin America, directly contradicting the stories my father had told me. They also introduced me to the social justice teachings of the post-Vatican II Catholic Church, opening my eyes to an entirely new way of understanding the faith that I'd inherited from my father's family, but had previously shied away from, flirting first with evangelical Christianity before abandoning that for my mother's more progressive and women-ordaining Anglican Church. Searching for a way to integrate my emerging political and spiritual values with the patchwork quilt of my own bicultural identity, I would travel first to Spain and then to Central America in the 1990s, visiting Guatemala and Nicaragua, where I worked as a translator for a church medical mission in the rural northern highlands, while considering and finally rejecting the idea of becoming a nun. A few years later, against my father's wishes, I made my first trip to Cuba, where in the same month that Cubans in Miami and Havana were mobilizing to fight a transnational custody battle over Balcero Elian Gonzalez, I encountered an island that felt simultaneously foreign and very much like home. Over the next several years, I would go back to Cuba many times, trying to make sense of a reality much richer and much more complicated than anything described in my father's angry stories, or for that matter, in my Central American friends' dreams of utopian revolution. Around that time in 1999, after a couple of years of substitute teaching in Vancouver, I secured a temporary contract teaching 6th grade at an international Catholic school in Tokyo. That temporary job turned into an offer of a permanent contract. And I ultimately ended up spending 8 years working as a Spanish, English, and social studies high school teacher at 2 different international Catholic schools in Tokyo and Yokohama, where I also worked as a freelance music journalist for a Spanish language magazine, while also living as a member of Tokyo's small and mostly Peruvian, Colombian, and Cuban Colonia Latina. During this time, I met my future husband, a Hungarian-Irish American from small-town Central California, and a Marine Corps F-18 pilot, who would eventually convince me to move to San Diego, where I began my Ph.D. in sociology in 2006. a program in which I lasted less than 1/4 before fleeing to the history department. After we got married in 2006, Mike would deploy repeatedly to Afghanistan, Iraq, and the Pacific, while I completed my doctoral studies in US and Latin American history, with vague plans of perhaps becoming a community college instructor someday. Pressured by my Chicano advisors at UCSD to apply for a UC president's postdoc, something I was certain I was unqualified for and would never be awarded, I would in fact be named a president's postdoc in 2011. And 2 years later, after fielding competing offers from Notre Dame and UCI, I accepted a joint appointment in our departments of Chicano Latino Studies and History. And the rest is sort of history. Over the last 8 years, I've advanced at a breakneck speed in my academic career. I've published a book, a dozen plus articles in the top journals of my field, and I have a second book in production. If the measure of success is scholarly productivity, I can confidently say that I've arrived. But my own metrics for what constitutes success are more complex. It's not that I don't care about my research. It's that I care more about saving lives. And that's what I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about now. Like most people who grew up poor, I always longed for safety and dignity. Elusive commodities for those many of us whose childhoods were defined by food and housing insecurity, physical or sexual abuse, secondhand clothes, and the constant stigmatization and bullying that comes with being the welfare kid, the kid whose dad isn't around, the kid whose mother has to ask other parents for a ride to buy groceries or for a loan to pay the electricity bill. My education and the circuitous career that I've built from it over the past 25 years have given me that safety and the dignity that I longed for. It gave me a way out of the future that I was statistically destined for, a continuation of the cycle of poverty, marginalization, and neglect that destroyed my mother's health and well-being, exacerbating her undiagnosed depression and her death from untreated lung cancer at the age of 54. It has allowed me to escape the economic insecurity and domestic instability and narrowed horizons that continue to define the lives of my own sisters and cousins and the kids I grew up with. My education, quite literally, has saved my life. It's also given me the resources to ensure that my daughter, Ana Sofia, will never know the kind of fear, neglect, or shame that defined my childhood. Unlike me, she will grow up confident in her right to a place in this world, the right to be fed and clothed and housed, the right to choose a life path based on her dreams and talents and values. That will always be the primary reason that I go to work every day. But I don't just go to work to advance my own child's welfare. As a Catholic feminist and as a mother, I feel a sense of responsibility towards all children and young people. I believe that they all have the same right to safety, dignity, and opportunity that I have been blessed to provide my own daughter. I also believe that all adults have an obligation to participate in protecting and advancing the rights of young people through concrete individual and collective action. This is why, as a faculty member at UCI, I unapologetically prioritize what I do in the classroom, as well as my other forms of mentorship and engagement with first-generation, low-income, Latinx, URM, and undocumented students, well beyond what is required to tick the box for service to UCI's Inclusive Excellence mission. Nobody asks me to do these things, and I don't get paid extra to do them. I do them because I know from experience that education is a life or death endeavor, and I am not speaking in hyperbole here. As any poor or marginalized person can tell you, there is life-transforming power in the relationships we form with educators who truly care for us, who reflect back to us our dignity and potential, who find ways to instill in us the hope that life will not always be as hard or as frightening as it is right now. As a person of faith, I see every interaction with my students as a daily opportunity to give life by effecting these kinds of transformation. I believe that all of the wounds that I bear from my childhood, as well as the privileges embedded in my white skin and my first world passport and my accent-free English, along with the new security and status that come with my Ph.D. and university job, these have all been given to me for a reason. I see them as sources of insight and empathy, tools that I'm supposed to use not just for my own well-being, but also to heal, inspire, and empower others. Tools that I can use to save lives, the way that my own life was saved by the K-12 community college and university educators who helped me to believe in and actualize my own potential. Now, I'm well aware that this sense of mission is at odds with the values of the scholarly profession of which I am a member. Even at a progressive R1 institution like UCI, there are still strong institutional and social disincentives to prioritizing teaching and mentorship, which continue to be seen by many as a waste of time better spent on research. And the efforts of the most engaged faculty, especially those women and faculty of color, upon whose efforts this campus's reputation for inclusive excellence relies, are not always fully recognized or rewarded. And even when people like me are celebrated for our commitment to students, I sometimes worry about whether this visibility serves to reinforce notions of poor women of color as natural caretakers and caregivers, the domésticas or the help of the academic community, rather than celebrating us as scholars and leaders, examples that our more privileged colleagues might emulate when considering what inclusive excellence looks like in practice, not just in theory. But I do the work anyway, because I'm determined to help UCI live up to its aspirations to serve as a vehicle for socioeconomic mobility and social justice. That's the metric that I measure my success against, not the number of publications I've racked up, although I'm proud of those too. But in the end, I will always be more concerned with the number of students' lives that I have helped to save. To be honest, though, this work has gotten harder lately. For more than a year now, our nation has been challenged by a long overdue racial reckoning, as well as a pandemic that has devastated communities of color and the poor. During this time, I've had to finish a book under advanced contract while learning to teach online and trying to support a growing number of students in crisis. I've shared these struggles with all of the faculty across campus, and especially with women and faculty of color that first-gen, low-income, and URM students most frequently turn to. But I've also managed these demands while trying to nurture a small child struggling with social isolation, anxiety, and the incredible challenges of independent online learning. And these things have left me more exhausted than I've ever been. With the end of the pandemic finally in sight and the campus poised to return to normal in the fall, I know that these demands will only increase. And so I feel increasingly torn between my sense of obligation to our campus community, the needs of my family, and my responsibility to my own physical and mental health. Since joining UCI's faculty in 2013, I've had many conversations about how to manage exactly these kinds of tensions with the countless first-gen, Latinx, and undocumented students who come to me feeling similarly exhausted, worried about their families and communities, and feeling guilty about focusing on their own education when others need them now. I've always reminded them that caring for and investing in themselves so that they can become stronger and wiser and therefore more useful to others isn't selfish. In fact, I encourage them to see it as a necessary part of sustaining a lifelong commitment to to social justice. Of course, I'm better at dispensing this advice than I am at taking it. I suspect that's a weakness that I share with many of you who are here today. Many of us in the UCI community need time to rest and recalibrate. In the face of so many urgent and ongoing demands, though, I'm not sure exactly how we're supposed to do that. But I do know this is something we can't do alone. We need proactive and tangible leadership and support from our campus leaders. We need them to be brave enough to reconsider how policies and practices and resource allocation models could be rethought to address some of the inequities that continue to make it harder for some of us, despite our contributions to the university's mission to thrive. Beyond that, though, to be honest, I have more questions than answers. But here's what I do know. In these difficult times, I believe that being authentic and vulnerable with one another is more necessary than ever. Pausing to reflect on the values that inspire and sustain us is essential. My hope is that conversations like this one about what matters to us and why will help us to find the purpose and the strength that we need to keep going, and that they will remind us of the need to continue working together to make this university the kind of place that we want it to be.
Thank you, Anita, for that inspirational message. And a lot of things to think about as well. So this is where we transition to allowing folks that have questions that they would like to ask Dr. Casavantes Bradford to address. And so I can't see all the screens at one time, but if you can maybe use the raise hand feature, that might be one way to assist me. And I'll try to skim through the chat as well if there's something from there. So if folks have a question or would like to raise a question or a comment, please feel free to raise your hand right now. All right, I think Berenice has her hand. Is there a hand up?
Yes, I just wanted to thank you, Professora, for sharing your journey. I think many of us who are first generation can empathize and with many of the things that you've just said. So thank you for being so vulnerable with us. It's incredibly inspiring, and for some of us who have been through just a little bit, anything similar to what you've been through, it's incredibly inspiring and gives us a glimmer of hope. I think that maybe someday we can aspire to be someone who's as amazing as you are. So thank you so much for sharing your life journey with us.
You're so welcome, Berenice, and I have complete confidence that in 10 years, they're going to be inviting you to give a talk like this, because I see so much of my own life story in you. So power through, Chica, you got this.
It's wonderful reading the different comments in the chat. And Anita, obviously you've inspired quite a few people in the room. Aurora has a question.
I actually have a comment too. I wanted to say, Professor Casavantes Bradford, that I really appreciate you sharing that with us. It helps me look at activism in a different way, because you have a nurturing spirit. And just recently, because I joined TikTok. Just recently, I see a lot of comments and stuff from activists, and they're very passionate. But sometimes it tends to be more anger and hate. And I understand it's important, that energy, it's a driving force. But to see it packaged in this way, in a supportive and nurturing way that really does advance what we want, is just, it's very refreshing. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's a challenge when you move in intellectual and activist circles to choose to frame your way of walking in the world as one of love. It's funny. I remember as a grad student, friends that were more more radical than me in terms of what they were willing to post on Facebook and the manifestos that they were willing to sign. And they would tease me about being a moderate. And I was always struck by that, because it made me think, what is moderate and what does radical mean to you, right? Because for me as a Catholic, or even somebody who studies language, right, radical means at the root of something, right? And for me, what is at the root or the foundation of a commitment to social justice is walking with and accompanying people, right? And so I would spend my weekends like serving mass in the fields and working with and trying to accompany folks. And then, you know, my classmates in grad school would sort of frame things like they were very radical and I was a moderate. And I was always struck by that. But there's, I think sometimes in activism and in political life and intellectual life, there's a focus on form and not substance. I have always been more concerned with substance. What do you do, right? What do you do to help and empower? What do you do to confront injustice? I'm less interested in words and more interested in action.
Very powerful. Thank you, Anita. Claire.
Yes, thank you very much for that wonderful talk. I guess I had two questions. One was, do you still have contact with your father, and what does he think of you now? And the other was, is your husband still in the military being deployed?
So the simple answer is that my husband left active duty a couple of years ago, but remains in the active reserves. So he continues to fly with the Marine Corps on a weekly basis, but he left active duty for a couple of reasons. One, because he didn't want to be separated from our young daughter, but also because of the political direction that our country was taking, made it harder for him to feel that was where his career wanted to go. So he's mostly at home with us, right? He flies for United when he's not flying for the Marine Corps. My father passed away last fall after a 10-year battle with Alzheimer's. And I did remain in touch with him. We had a close but very combative relationship until my own daughter was born. And it really wasn't until my daughter was born and I was confronted with the blessing and the privilege and the awesome responsibility of caring for another person's life that I really realized all of the ways that my father had not cared for me or my sisters. And so the last 10 years of my relationship with him were much trickier. And I wrestled with my own feelings of like familial obligation, deference to a father figure, empathy for the incredibly hard life that he lived. He was a prisoner of war. He was brutalized and suffered in many ways. He lost a homeland. He had his own pain, right? So, you know, being torn between reconciling what you needed from a parent and didn't get from them and having empathy for their own struggles made things very challenging. When he passed away last year, I was able to, you know, find a way to honor his life, honor the blessings that he did give me. He gave me a fierce intelligence. He gave me a storytelling skill. He gave me a rich legacy in addition to the things that he didn't give me, right? But que en paz descanse, Padre. I hope he rests in peace.
Was he proud of you, of your accomplishments?
Extraordinarily. He eventually got over the fact that I had chosen to visit Cuba, to spend time on the island. He read some of my scholarship and he realized that I had chosen to take what we would call sort of a third way, that I had chosen to respectfully critique the path the Cuban Revolution has taken since 1959, while acknowledging the history that produced that revolution. That meant something to him. That made it possible for him to believe that he hadn't lost a daughter, but that he had, you know, that there was still a connection between the two of us, right? That there were things about his experience and our family's experiences that I hadn't diminished, right? Because regardless of politics, the Cuban American community, regardless of their politics, are people that have lost a homeland. They've lost their neighborhoods. They've lost their homes, right? There's loss, there's trauma there. And I think that finding ways to see that above and beyond ideology, the ideology that continues to separate Cubans and Cuban Americans is important. And that was sort of the thread on which our relationship continued to work. And in that, I think I owe a lot to two mentors that are in the room, Don Ruben Rumbaut and Professor Raul Fernandez Martin, that have been mentors and have helped me to see Cuba through kind and respectful critical eyes, and especially through Professor Fernandez for founding UC-Cuba, which I now co-direct, which is a research community that specifically asks scholars of all backgrounds to be brave enough, to be expansive enough in their thinking, to approach Cuba with an open mind and an open heart. So thank you to those mentors.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anita, for your transparency, vulnerability, and as an Iranian American, I can relate a lot of my heritage and background with what stories you're sharing. So the transferability of that. Melissa, you've had your hand up.
Yeah, you used a term that actually caused me to smile, and that was a feminist Catholic. Can you talk a little bit more about what that means to you, how you reconcile what would ordinarily be opposing terms?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there are so many opposing terms, aren't there, in so many of the realities of our life. I think that being a Catholic, which is a religion that emphasizes the place of mystery in the way that particular Jewish traditions also do as well, Sufi Islam as well, right? Traditions that focus on mystery have a space for the contradictions that are inherent in life, right? The Catholic Church is in many ways an incredibly regressive institution and an incredibly patriarchal institution. It is also a vessel of some of the most profound and most sustained philosophical and theological justifications for liberation, for uplifting the poor. And finding my space in that has been challenging, but I've been inspired primarily by Catholic sisters, by the Catholic nuns who I've seen in action, who have lived out lives that, from their perspective, are full of empowerment and are full of service. And I admire them and have found a role model in them. Do I align with everything that the Catholic Church stands for? Absolutely not. Do I align with everything that the US government stands for? Absolutely not. And yet here I live. Right? The church is a broken vessel, just like our government is a broken vessel. Just like any human institution is a broken vessel that's been made by imperfect people. And so I see both good and bad in the institution. I see inspiration and oppression in the institution, but the inspiration speaks to me. I choose to try to live according to that inspiration. I also believe that at the core of it, once you get past all of the distorting BS ideology and the overemphasis on sexual morality and women's reproductive rights, which have become just the focus of so much religious life nowadays, I believe that respecting the dignity of life, respecting the ideal of protecting lives, protecting immigrant lives, protecting refugee lives, protecting the lives of the poor, protecting Black lives, protecting children's lives. There's enough right there in that for me to spend the rest of my life trying to live up to, that the rest of it, like, we can work on it as we go. I guess that's my take.
All right, thank you for the question. Do we have other questions or comments? I know there are a lot of comments in the chat, so hopefully we'll be able to preserve this and pass this on to Dr. Casavantes Bradford. But I see the Honorable Val Janess with the hand up.
Not feeling so honorable today, but thanks for saying that, Ramin. Great talk, Anita. I feel like I know you, and then I just feel like I learned a whole bunch more about you, and I so appreciate your willingness to share and reveal. I mean, that's a really wonderful thing.
Yeah, it's okay. I had a shot of rum before this talk because I wasn't sure I was going to be able to do it. So.
I often think the world would be better off if we were all comfortable with being vulnerable and revealing, but such is the social world. Okay, so much of what you said caught my attention, and as you know, I'm sitting in this administrative role, and I guess it's almost predictable. I would ask for your thoughts about how this campus is going to truly recognize and reward what we flippantly call diversity work. And so much of what you described is the kind of labor that you and so many others do. We also flippantly call it invisible labor. It's not invisible at all. It is on full display in people's lives and in the way this institution is held together. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to say a little bit more when you have an audience of people that want to know how to do this and get it right, but flail. And I put myself in that category. How do we do that? And especially when you said recognize and reward. And I just want to hear more about that.
I mean, this is why folks like you are in leadership and I am not, right? Because I still don't know the answers to that question myself. I guess I would say that for me, more and more I'm learning that the answer to so many of the struggles that I encounter on a theoretical level today are actually, again, back in the lessons of my working class childhood. And as I've become increasingly close to my students of color, my immigrant, Latinx, and first-gen students, I've realized that we're not interested in performative equity and inclusion, right? We want to be able to pay for our educations. We want to be able to have access to the classes that are needed, the tutoring that is needed. We want professors that will, work with students to give them extra time when they need it to finish work because they got called into a shift that they can't cancel or they'll lose their job. We need to deal with each other in the practical material spaces where hard lives happen. As a faculty member, I would say what that means is we have to look at the really boring and obscure details of our policies and our practices to figure out where are the invisible inequities hidden. Budget models that allocate FTEs to department based on how many majors they have without taking into consideration the incredible work that African American, Asian American, gender and sexuality studies, Chicano Latino studies do to sustain and support these populations at the university. Those kind of budget allocation models contribute to invisible inequity because they don't reward and empower and sustain folks that are serving an important part of the university's mission, right? I would say finding ways to not just celebrate the equity and inclusion work of minoritized faculty, but to require similar contributions from more privileged faculty by asking them to learn how to be better mentors, by asking them how to support minoritized faculty in their departments, to do some concrete work, to share that burden would be a place to start. I don't know how exactly, but I have confidence in you, Val, and others like you that do know the details and intricacies of our policies and know where those inequities are hiding to ferret them out. And you know what? It's not pretty and it's not shiny. It's easier to hold a workshop. It's easier to ask a brown or a Black person or a gay person or a trans person or a refugee to give a talk and share their voice. But the power that comes in changing one policy that allows faculty or students to thrive, to have a more of an equal playing field, to me, that just eclipses any number of talks that I could give in a space like this, right? So folks like you, folks like Ramin, folks who are in those leadership positions, I really do rely on you.
We do have a few more minutes, actually. I think I can squeeze another question or two in. So if anyone wants to, I forgot to mention, you can raise your hand by hitting the reactions, if you don't know, the reactions button, and then there's a raise hand, and then that's how you can go to. So Fabiola.
Thank you, Anita. This was amazing. I'm going to take a deep breath and ask you if you could comment on microaggressions and imposter syndrome, which for us, first generation, even, I'm a food professor and microaggressions are left and right. Can you comment on that, please? Thank you.
Yeah. Pues sí, imposter syndrome, right? The day-to-day reality of women and folks of color and poor folks in academia, where we're constantly convinced that it was a mistake that we got here, right? I spent an hour in office hours yesterday talking to two incredibly talented Latina undergrads about just the ongoing journey of imposter syndrome. You know, my second book is coming out, and still when I sit down to look at an empty page to write an article, my brain screams at me, "You can't do this. You don't have what it takes to write this." And I've just learned to treat that fear and that imposter syndrome as like a passenger in the car. You're coming along on this ride, but you know, you don't get to hold the map. You don't get to touch the stereo. I'm the one that decides where we're going, right? You can come along. I think it's really more about like, we don't eradicate the imposter syndrome. We learn to live with it lovingly and firmly, right? And to get some distance from it and understand that that is not a reflection of our abilities. Microaggressions, and we are all guilty of them, right? In one of my classes last week, a student used a term that in Spanish is a innocent and widely used term to refer to Asian folks, but it is not a respectful term, right? And although the majority of students in my class, that particular class, are Latinx, there are Asian students and Black students and white students in that class. And, you know, you're then confronted with, oh, okay, so here is this moment of a microaggression. How do I offer a micro intervention to try to make this situation, you know, a learning moment, right? And so I waited a few minutes, and then in a private chat to the student just said, hey, I wanted to thank you for raising the point that there's this enormous diversity amongst Asian communities. As a gentle suggestion, though, that term has one meaning in a Spanish-speaking context. In this context, it could be seen as hurtful. I'm pretty sure that wasn't your intention. How do you think we should handle this, right? And the student immediately was like, oh, allow me to apologize to the whole class. And we took 5 minutes, and the student just so bravely and so humbly said to the class, you know, I used this term. I didn't really think about it. I realize now that that could be hurtful, and I'm sorry. And then I just took a moment to say, like, hey, students, in case you're not aware of it, this person is showing courage and integrity. This person is modeling for you how we learn to treat each other better, right? And my brilliant students got it, and like they blew up the chat with messages of support for that student, right? And some of them put in, oh, I've used that term too, and now I realize that that's not appropriate. And so there are moments when we have the strength or the grace to intervene, and they play out. And then there are the moments when we're on the receiving end of them, right? And it's exhausting. How to deal with that? I guess the important thing is having as big of a supportive community as you can. Here at UCI, people who, again, reflect back to you your dignity and your accomplishment, and then learning in graceful ways to say out loud when people say things to us. Oh, hey, by the way, I know you mean to praise me for my maternal work with students, but by the way, I'm also an incredible researcher. I'd love to send you a copy of my most recent publication, right? But I think we find that grace and that strength in one another in our communities. And I define community very broadly, right? Across race, across ethnicity, across gender, sexuality, whatever. We know our community, we know our folks when we meet them, right? We get that grace from community, and we get it from whatever source of internal strength each of us has. For me, it's partly my faith. It's partly my little girl, right? It's whatever gives you strength, right? And you and I nos debemos un cafecito. I know that, like, we need to have a coffee.
I think that's a beautiful way to end this inspirational talk. Again, I want to let everyone have a chance to shoot out an emoji for Dr. Casavantes Bradford for really being vulnerable and sharing such a beautiful story for everybody. So I'll even cut a fake clap right there. So.
Thank you, everyone. I'm so honored that so many of you came today. I just really feel like I'm entre familia, I'm within family. And those of you that I don't know, if you ever want to chat, I love getting emails. So hope to stay in touch.
I want to honor everyone here and your time for being here. We're right up on the hour. And again, if you have the survey, please feel free to fill that out. That's real important to us. And again, once again, thanking Dr. Anita Casavantes Bradford for their talk today. So thank you all for participating in What Matters to Me and Why.